are very much clear to you, whatever we have studied till now. So after the functions of operating system, which I have just discussed, such as process management, memory management, then we have storage management, file management, protection and security. There are some interesting services which are provided by any operating system, and these services can be viewed as in two different categories. So we will just discuss it. So operating system provides an environment for the execution of programs. So this is the most important task of any operating system. It provides an environment to its users so that users can execute programs, user can solve their complex problems. So there are different types of operating system services. So one set of OS services provides the functions which are helpful for the users. So these are the services which are provided by operating systems to its users. So the very first service includes this user interface. So almost all operating systems have a user interface, and these interface can be of different type. The very first is the command line interface, second is the graphical user interface, and third is the bash interface. So in the command line interface, we used to have a text command, and we use generally a keyboard for entering those text command. And most of you must have heard about an operating system of Microsoft, that is MS-DOS, which stands for Disk Operating System. So this was the old operating system provided by Microsoft, which was totally based on this command line interface. There we do not have a graphical user interface just like Windows or the modern operating system. The user needs to communicate with the machine, with the hardware, using the commands only, and user used to enter the information using keyboard in the form of text only. So there was no mouse, there was no icons. So command line interface was the earlier concept which was used in MS-DOS. And now very modern operating system provides the graphical user interface, which provides convenience to the user, as we have discussed in the very first lecture that why Windows was so popular for so long years. So the only reason is the convenience, the ease of use, just because of this graphical user interface. Even a child can easily interact with the machine. If we have the Windows operating system, we know we can just simply use the click of the mouse, the pointer to open the files and directories. We can run anything. So that provides easiness to the user of the computer. And the last category is bash interface, which is not that much popular. Here we used to have commands and directives which are first entered into the files, and then those files are executed. So it is the complex form of user interface. So the most commonly used interface is the graphical user interface, which provides convenience to its user. Second important services or the service provided by any operating system is the program execution. So this is the major task of any operating system. So the operating system must be able to load the program into the memory and to run that program to complete the execution. So that execution can be normal or it can be abnormal. So this is the major task of any operating system. If we want to run any program or any process, so first operating system must bring that process from the secondary memory to the RAM or the main memory. Then it must allocate those processes to the CPU for the execution, as we have discussed in the last lecture in multi-programming and multitasking. Third important service provided by any operating system to its user is input-output operation. So as I have discussed in multi-programming also, a running program or a process may require input-output operations to perform, and that may involve any input-output device or any file. So operating system is responsible for this particular activity. Similarly, we have file system manipulation, where we may require to open a file, to read or write any file, to create or delete the files, and to grant some permissions for a particular set of user. So this is another interesting service provided by an operating system to its user. Communication is very important, in which one process might need to exchange the information with the other process. And generally this communication takes place via shared memory or through a message passing concept. So that we will just discuss in detail in the process synchronization chapter. And the last service which is provided by operating system for their users is the error detection. So operating system must be able to eradicate the various errors or any kind of fault. So error may occur in the CPU or in the memory or in the input output devices. So for any kind of error, the operating system must take the appropriate action to correct that particular error, so that the execution of program must not halt and it must go smoothly. Along with error correction, error detection, debugging facilities should be there, so that it must be able to cure the things, and the functioning of the processes may work or may go smoothly. So these are the first category, which is the operating system services which are helpful for the user. So there is second category also. This is the another set of operating system functions which exist for ensuring the efficient operation of the system itself. So you can see this first category are the various services which is provided by an operating system to its users, or we can say which are helpful for the users, because users want to interact with the system. So there should be an user interface, there should be the facility of program execution, input output operations, communication, and error detection. Now there are some another services also which are provided by operating system, this time not for the users but for the efficient operation of the computer system itself. So the very first and the most important service provided by any operating system is the resource allocation. So there are so many different users, there are so many different programs or processes which are executing at a single time. So operating system decides how to allocate the various resources. If suppose there are 5 different processes, if 2 processes in a single time needs any input output operation, suppose both the processes wants to access the printer at the same time, so how to allocate, firstly P1 को execute होगा या P2 को execute होगा, this all is managed by this operating system. RAM में कौन सा प्रोसेस आएगा, कंप्लीट होने के बाद कौन सा प्रोसेस RAM से वापस हार्ड डिस्क में चला जाएगा. So this entire very interesting and important functionality of resource allocation is managed by operating system. Second important services is accounting, where operating system keep track of how many users and what kind of computer resources are used. And third is, as I have just discussed, the protection and security is one of the most important service provided by any operating system. Protection includes the access to the system resources, whereas security deals with the system from outsider. We must require user authentication, or we can say the protection from the viruses or the worms or any hazardous thing. So this is the services. Okay, so now this particular diagram is very important. Here you can see at the top we have users, and at the bottom we have hardware. So in the very first lecture, when I was explaining the concept of or the definition of operating system, so there we have read that an operating system is an intermediate between the computer hardware and the user of the computer. So there you can see here at the top level we have computer user, at the bottom level we have hardware, and in between user and the hardware we have an operating system which is acting as an intermediate between the user and the hardware. Now these are various services provided by an operating system which I have just discussed in the past 10 minutes. So an operating system provides various services to its users, such as execution of the programs, to perform input-output operations, for process communication, resource allocation, error detection, and protection and security. So these all are the various services which are provided by operating system. Even this is the user interface. So an operating system may provide the graphical user interface, the bash interface, or the command line interface. Now one important term which is in the center of this diagram is system call. So I will talk about this system call just after 5 minutes. Before that we have to go through these various user interfaces, as we have studied in the services which are provided by any operating system. The very first service is the user interface. So all operating system provide any kind of user interface. So it can be command line, it can be graphical user interface, or it can be a bash user interface. So command line interface, it's also commonly known as command interpreter, which allows us to directly enter the command. So we may use the keyboard to enter the text commands, and generally it is also known as the shell programming, or they are the interface is also known as the shell. But if I talk about this graphical user interface, this is the user friendly, which generally contains a keyboard, a mouse, a monitor. There are so many different icons which represents the directories, the files, the programs, and we can easily access or open any location of the system using this graphical user interface. And nowadays, many system includes both command line interface as well as the graphical user interface, just depending upon the feasibility or the convenience of the user. As you can see, some of the example is there. Microsoft Windows is graphical user interface with CLI command shell. Similarly, Apple Mac operating system X has Aqua GUI interface as well as the Unix kernel underneath and shells available, which acts as a command line interface. So there is one more operating system which is Solaris, and Solaris also contains both kind of user interface, command line as well as graphical user interface. So you can see this is the Bourne shell command interpreter. This is an example of command line interface where user generally enter the commands with the help of the keyboard, and all the things can be accessed as well as processed using this command interpreter. And if I talk about the graphical user interface, some of you might be using or might be having the Apple Mac operating system. So this is the graphical user interface provided by the Mac operating system. So it is much more convenient to have or to use the system if we have graphical user interface as compared to the command line or bash user interface. Okay, so this was all about the basics of the services which are provided by any operating system. Now you can see this diagram I was just discussing. In the center, in the middle of this particular diagram, we have a system calls. So I think rest all the things mentioned in this particular diagram is very much clear to you. An operating system is an intermediate between user and the hardware, and these are the various services which are provided by any operating system, which we have just discussed in detail. So in between we have a system call. So now we will discuss about what is a system call. Okay, so system call provides an interface to the services made available by an operating system. So जितनी भी services operating system provide करता है for its user or for its own efficiency, we can access, or we can say system call is an interface to all the services which are provided by this operating system. Which means if a user want to perform any of the task like program execution or input output operation or file system, so user must use a system call for executing or for taking the functionalities of these services. So system call is nothing. System call is an interface to the services which are provided by the operating system. And system calls are generally written in any high level language. It can be C or C++, but there are so many different system calls. हर ऑपरेटिंग सिस्टम की अपनी खुद की बहुत सारी अलग सिस्टम कॉल्स होती हैं, and it is not possible for any user to remember all those system calls to have the services from the operating system. So that's why we have a concept of APIs, which stands for Application Programming Interface. So the users access the programs using APIs rather than just using the system calls directly. and every operating system has its own system call. So for now, you can just assume that system call is a set of functions which are predefined for a specific or an individual operating system. So I'm just going to give you an example so that thing will be more clear. For now, from this diagram, you can easily assume that if we want to take any service from the operating system, so system call is an interface, it is a medium to access those services. And those system calls vary for different operating system, and there are hundreds or thousands of system calls for the operating systems. And there is generally a number associated with each system call. So let's take an example of Windows operating system. So Windows operating system is having around 500, more than 500 system calls. So all those system call is having a specific number, and the system call interface generally maintains a table indexed according to these numbers. And the system call interface invokes the system call in OS kernel and returns the status of the system call and any value also. So just let me show you this thing. So there are two different modes. One is the user mode, second is the kernel mode. User mode is the mode in which generally user work. So if we are writing any C program, we are working in the user mode. So as long as we want to execute that program, or suppose we just want to print any statement on our console, so that thing will be performed by the operating system. We will just execute the program, and after that the control will shift to the operating system, and it is the responsibility of the operating system to execute this program or process and to give us the output as according. So now for user, we know that we must use the printf statement in C programming to display any string or any line or any output. But as long as we are writing printf, so this is a kind of an API or a local function for the user. But if I talk about the operating system, so operating system will not identify printf, it will just convert this printf into the write. So right now here is a system call which operating system understands. It is the predefined function or predefined system call for the operating system. So we will write printf, but OS will take it as write system call, and operating system will understand that whatever is written inside this will have to print on the machine or on the monitor. So this is how system call work. User generally do not use system call. System call is to be used by operating system only. User just interact or user just access the various services with the help of APIs only. Now there are so many different types of system call depending upon the various services provided by operating system. So first of all, we have the process control. So we have process control system calls where the various system calls include end, abort, load the processes, to execute the processes, to create process, terminate process, for waiting the process, or allocating the memory to our process. Similarly, we have some system calls for file management. So where we used to create a file, to delete a file, to open a file, to close a file, to read and write from a file. So all these are the predefined system calls which operating system understands, and it provides the services to the user according to these system calls. Similarly, we have some other interesting system calls for device management, for information maintenance, and for communication also. And this is very important to understand. So different operating systems have different kind of system calls. So here you can see, if I talk about, or if we compare Windows and the Unix. So in the lab yesterday with IT41 batch, we have just learned how to create a process, a duplicate process, or a child process. So you can see here clearly, if we are working in Unix, we use the fork system call to create a child process. But if we are working in Windows, so we have a different system call, which is the create process, which will perform exactly the same task as performed by this fork system call in the Unix. So we have fork, exit, and wait system calls in Unix. Similarly, we have create process, exit process, and wait for single object system calls in Windows. So these are the list of various system calls. So this is not the entire system call. As I have just explained you, Windows operating system consists of more than 500 system calls. Similarly, Unix is also having so many different system calls. And as you can see, for file manipulation, we have open, read, write, close. So you might have heard these terms in the file handling in your C programming also. Similarly, for device manipulation, we have input output control, reading the device, writing to the device, and get PID also we have implemented in the lab yesterday. This is the function which is used to get the process ID of the current process. And you can see in the Windows, we have a different system call with the name get current process ID. So this is how the things differ operating system to operating system. Windows has its own system call, Unix has its own system call. In Unix and Linux mostly, we can directly use or access the system calls, but it is not the case in Windows. The users who work with Windows, mostly they use APIs, the concept of application programming interface, rather than using the system calls directly. But you must think, if we want to have any kind of services which are provided by an operating system, so system call is an interface to those services which are provided by any operating system. Okay, moving on to the last topic for today. This is the system programs. So it is a kind of a system call, but we will see how it differs. So system programs provide a convenient environment for the program execution as well as the program development. And as we have just divided the system calls into various categories, as you can see, process control, file management, device management, communication, information maintenance. Similarly, we can also divide the system programs into almost same kind of categories, because these are all the services or the functions provided by any operating system. So you can see we have file manipulation, file modification, status information, the communication, program loading and execution, and various application programs. So most users' view of the operating system is defined by the system programs, not by the actual system calls. So system programs are more familiar or more concerned from the user's point of view rather than the system calls, because system call is reserved for the operating system. They are the predefined functions or the calls for the working of OS only, but generally a user deals with various system programs. So you can see in the case of file management, we have same creating a file, deleting a file, renaming a file, printing a file, and there can be so many operations related with or modification or manipulation of the directories. Similarly, status information may include the system information, just as the date or the time, the amount of space available, the number of users, and some other information like logging and debugging information also. And similarly, we have some more system programs which include file modification, then programming language support, where we used to have various compilers, assemblers, debuggers, and then we have the programs related with the loading and execution of the program or the process, where we will talk about the linkers and the loaders and debugging system for high-level languages as well as the machine language. And another category of system programs is communication, where we have a virtual connection between the various users and the processes and the computer system. And through this system program, users are able to send messages to each other, to browse the web pages, or to send email. Even we can log in remotely, and we can transfer file from one machine to other machine. So these are all system programs which are provided. And just before system programs, we have studied or discussed about the system calls. But if you can read this second line, the most users' view of the operating system is defined by the system programs, not by the actual system calls. So if we talk about the computer or the operating system, they generally deal with system calls. But if I talk about the users or the user's point of view, they generally deal with the system program. So this is all about for today's lecture, where we have discussed various functions such as process management, memory management, storage management, and after that we have discussed in detail the various services which are provided by an operating system, which covers services for the users and the services for the system itself. And after that, this interesting diagram, we have seen what is a system call. So it is an interface to the services which are provided by any operating system. And we have seen so many different examples of system calls, the categories of system call, and after the system call, we have just focused on the last topic, that was the system programs, which is more concerned, or which is more familiar, which is more close to a user or from the user's point of view rather than system call. So any user hardly uses system call, either user uses system programs, or the user is more interested in working with APIs rather than any system calls. So this is all about the today's lecture. In the next lecture, we will talk about the various different kind of structures of operating system, and we will see some more interesting examples of an operating system.